Top 10 list most racist places in the United States. YouTuber The World According to Briggs just did this video. I want to make my own version of it. As you guys know, I lived in Alabama for 1 year, so I have a PhD in racism. I really enjoy watching his videos, but he lives on the West Coast. And in the South, I've been all over. I've lived in several of these states, and we have family that lives in these states. We're very familiar with the South. So definitely not hating on The World According to Briggs. I'm just giving you from my perspective what I think the top 10 most racist states are. For example, he had North Carolina rated worst than South Carolina. That's definitely not accurate. I definitely recommend that you see his video as well to get a shared perspective on this. He used some type of weird analytic I've never heard before, but it has to do with crime and police and stuff. But look, there's no way to measure this stuff. This stuff is just real life experience. It's a hard thing to measure. But number 10 is the state of Georgia, especially the southern part of Georgia. You're going to have to use caution while traveling through this part of the state, especially the small towns. You get into South Georgia, you're talking the real deep South. There's still plantations out here. I mean, like, slavery in the past is still alive. Presently, you can see like plantations and stuff. As you travel through cities like Columbus, Albany, you're going to notice, you're going to feel the racism. You're going to notice, you're going to feel uncomfortable. You walk into a restaurant and, you're just going to know it doesn't feel right. And that is definitely present in the state of Georgia. The reason Georgia is ranked kind of low on my list is because the northern part of the state is a whole lot better, and the geographical area of Georgia isn't exactly large. If you're traveling through small southern Georgia towns, you're going to have to be very careful in dealing with racism. Number 9 is the state of Texas. The reason Texas is more racist than Georgia on my list is because geographically it's so much bigger. Even some of the larger cities like Dallas and Fort Worth are going to be known for racism. Take the clown Charleston White. He's from the Dallas-Fort Worth area. If you listen to some of his ideologies and the way he talks about other people, you can definitely tell he's coming from a place of hate. But as you get into the smaller cities of Texas in the west side of the state and in the northeast side of the state around Naples, Marshall, anything from like the Oklahoma border back towards places like Tyler and Longview, these are really racist, backwards places. There's even sundown towns right outside of Houston. Of course, the city of Houston's different. Austin and San Antonio are definitely different. Those are big cities. Usually big cities don't have that much racism. Moving on to number 8, the state of Indiana. This might be a surprise to a lot of people, but back in the 1930s and 20s, the organization had a lot of members, and Indiana was one of the places where they really had a lot of members. And most people who are from this state, if they look at their pedigree, they're going to have family members that were part of that whole movement. Take my wife's grandpa. He was from Indiana. You could totally tell he was definitely having some interesting views. A lot of towns in Indiana are 95, 96, 98% white. One of the characteristics of racism is this is for us and for nobody else. There are Hispanic communities that are moving into Anderson and Indianapolis, and the way they are treated and the way they are perceived by other people is just an indication of the mindsets that people have. Indiana continues to be very hostile to outsiders, and it's definitely not a place you want to move to if you don't fit the profile. Moving on to number 7, the state of Louisiana. A lot of places in Louisiana, like New Orleans, are a gumbo of Creole, Cajun, and all types of cultures mixed together. However, there are parts of northern Louisiana, when you get in there, you're entering another world. Hospitality is a nightmare. Racism here takes part of every aspect of life, whether you're getting off at a gas station, whether you're checking into a hotel or eating at a restaurant. You have to be extraordinarily agile in identifying and being able to notice when you're being treated with racism, because it can actually be dangerous in some places. The reason the state's not higher on the list for me is because the entire state is not like that. Monroe, Shreveport, Baton Rouge are places where you have to tread very carefully. Usually our experiences there are horrible, but recently I have met some great people in Baton Rouge. Moving on to number 6, Arkansas. This is one of the few places in the United States where I have seen things so blatantly and openly racist that they were shocking to me. Somebody who spent 20 years in Florida, 4 years in Kentucky, 1 year in Alabama, for me to say I've seen shockingly racist things in Arkansas, that should give you an idea of the type of things and vibes you're going to get in this state. Some parts of the state are predominantly black, other parts of the state are predominantly white, and they are regionally separated by a mountain range. The state is beautiful and it has a lot to offer culturally, but you're going to have to be very keen to little details that are going to let you know that you're in a dangerous area, and sometimes those uncomfortable vibes can be very well felt. While this state could, for its natural beauty, be one of the top travel destinations in the United States, people are aware that it's a backwards and racist state, and many people are even afraid to travel through here. Number 5 is Mississippi. There's a lot of reasons why Mississippi is not the worst on this list. Whether you're looking for accommodations or restaurants, you're going to be very uncomfortable in Mississippi, and people will do things that are passive aggressive, which means if you're unfamiliar with regionalism of racism, you will probably pass it as bad customer service or a personal bad experience. However, I can assure you that those bad experiences and those bad customer service things that happened to you in Mississippi were racially motivated. It's not exactly a fun state to visit, and there's a very few things in this state that would really make you want to see more of it. My experiences in Mississippi have made me feel uncomfortable, and it's just a place I don't even like to visit. It's very hostile to outsiders, and it doesn't matter who you are, you're going to feel uncomfortable and unwelcomed here. Moving on to number 4, the state of Kentucky, which I lived in for 4 years. Even the large cities like Louisville have a huge problem with racism here. The blacks don't like the Irish don't like, it's just one huge mess of hate. And once you get away from the major roads and step into the more isolated regions of Kentucky, these people are very isolated. People seldomly travel through these parts of Kentucky, and if you find yourself traveling through these parts of Kentucky, you'll find that there's a lot of regionalism here. Both Katie and me have family in Kentucky and friends that we visit throughout the years, and it's almost always a very awkward experience when you get out into the rural small towns. Kentucky doesn't exactly have the worst reputation, but it's definitely a very racist state, and when you get away into the small towns, regionalism here and sentiments are very, very backwards and strange. Moving on to number 3, West Virginia. Geographically isolated, it's not a surprise that West Virginians have a hard time acclimating to outsiders when they live surrounded by mountain ranges and pretty much incommunicated from the rest of the world. I mean, when we came into West Virginia, we literally had to go through a mountain in a tunnel to enter the state. It's very isolated. Within that isolation comes the fact that these people just haven't experienced what's really out there. A lot of West Virginians have left their states for a lot of reasons: lack of opportunity, lack of employment, and a lot of addiction has destroyed these communities. The dependency on coal was also a huge failure for the state. Pretty much these are poor rural areas, and they really don't know how to deal with strangers. But I will tell you this, a lot of the people that I meet from West Virginia that live in other states are some of the most beautiful and awesome people I've ever met. Number 2 is South Carolina. This should come as no surprise. South Carolina is one of the most aggravating places you're going to find traveling through the United States. Customer service is bad. People's attitudes are usually nasty. The state's crime rate is usually one of the highest. I've been traveling in and out of the state since 2012, and as far as I can remember, nothing but bad experiences almost every single time we come through the state. Some parts of the state, when you get away from the major roads, are creepy and unsettling. The state's history and some of its modern achievements are not far from each other. Putting North Carolina higher than South Carolina is either a clickbait idea that Briggs had, or it's just he doesn't really understand what this coast is about. North Carolina has a lot more progressive places like Raleigh, Cary, Apex. The list goes on and on. South Carolina is just another world. Number one is Alabama. The state's laws are the number one culprit. So what could be said about everything else? It's a state where they don't pave the roads in the areas that are black, while the roads are perfectly paved in all the white areas. I've literally, while living in Alabama, walked into a restaurant and had everybody get up and walk out, and then everybody get mad at you. When I lived in Alabama, I stopped following. I never followed segregation laws, and at times this made very dangerous, awkward, and just very uncomfortable situations because I refused to follow segregation laws, which are still in full effect in Alabama, and it really led to a lot of problems for us. But I wasn't going to become like them. And the pressure isn't just the white people. Like, people have the notion that's the white people in Alabama. It's everybody in Alabama. Even like minorities have to play into the politics of racism in some way or another to get gas or to just do regular things. I got sick and tired of it. I flipped out towards the end of my living in Alabama, and I just became the most ignorant and belligerent person you could imagine because I was just so sick of living in the segregation society. I wasn't going to conform to it, and it just made me angry. I even had friends tell me that if I stay in Alabama, I was just going to become just like these people. The mindsets here are backwards. The state hasn't changed, and it's possible that in some areas it's actually worse than in the 1960s. If you ask people in Alabama, a lot of them will tell you things were probably better in the 1960s than they are now, because now it's even worse. Another thing going on in Alabama now is that it's not blacks versus white. It's mostly everybody versus immigrants, and it's kind of changed the dynamic of things in the last few years, possibly for the worse if you're an immigrant. We could go on forever about the recent things that are happening in Alabama that would suggest that if from the top it's rotten, what else could be said about the bottom? But the state governors made a "No Way Jose" speech. That was painful to hear, especially since I'm Hispanic and my name is Jose. That was just so hurtful. Then there was HB 56. Then there was now a new law aiming at homelessness. It's just a state that has no respect for human rights to this day. And the people here get a kick out of putting their state rights ahead of the U.S. Constitution. It's a complete mess. Other states that could have easily made this list, Ohio could have easily made this list. I feel that Missouri could have easily made this list, followed by Florida, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, and then North Carolina. Briggs did put Arizona, for political reasons, as one of the most racist places in the country. The West Coast doesn't even remotely come close to this list. But if I was going to put a state on the West Coast, I would have put California first, because if you watch enough content coming out of California today, you realize that even in Los Angeles and San Francisco, there's a huge mess right now among the cities. If that's the cities, don't even get started on the small towns. We also know that in California, the prison system is segregated completely. That trickles down into the streets, into music, and into literally subcultures of living in California. Don't get me wrong, I really do understand why he threw Arizona in there, but that's not really the essence of racism. The essence of racism isn't a political context. Take Baltimore, Maryland as an example, or Birmingham, Alabama as an example, that Democratic places can also be very racist. Go to Birmingham or Baltimore as a white person and you'll feel very uncomfortable. He also threw Maine in there as a joke. Actually, I've heard people from Maine tell me that are from there that a lot of these states like Maine, the ones that are really, really far out, like Maine, North Dakota, places that just minorities in general are a minute percentage of the population. The only state on my list that's here is actually West Virginia. But one could assume places like New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, the Dakotas, and Wyoming, places where other minorities are very small, you can assume that the reason they don't have a lot of immigrants is because they're very hostile to outsiders. And then regionalism plays just as much of a role in the racism as being hostile to outsiders. There's a huge rivalry between Michigan and Ohio that's football related, but you do have some real regionalistic differences like Alabama and Louisiana. Texas has some interesting regionalistic issues going on. Even Oklahoma, I considered throwing on this list. It's not like the communities there that are immigrants are doing very well. They seem like really poor and rundown places. So this list could have almost included a lot of other states. But there's no doubt that as far as like the refinement of this list, West Virginia, Alabama, South Carolina are as bad as it gets.